conspiracy theory is JFK. The movie is called JFK. It came out not too long ago, probably in the 90s. I'm sure it's on Netflix. If you look it up, it is, obviously you got to keep in mind it's a Hollywood movie, but there are some things in there, they raise a lot of questions. And again, like, it's dramatized for Hollywood, but it is somewhat historically accurate in terms of what they look at. And there's a lot of people, a significant number of Americans believe that the Kennedy assassination was a conspiracy. I know Trump actually, pretty quickly after taking office, declassified some documents surrounding the Kennedy assassination. It didn't really tell us anything, but it was interesting that it still had portions blacked out, and that's because some of these people are still alive that gave testimony, and they just don't want them to get flack, like, still to this day. It's kind of interesting. There's some definitely some things that have been covered up. It would be interesting to see. I don't know 100% where we're at. Personally, if you want to know my opinion, I think it was some kind of a conspiracy. I don't think Lee Harvey Oswald did it by himself. I think that lone gunman idea is kind of foolish. There's something going on here, but to what it is, I don't know. Just be careful if you go YouTube, Kennedy assassination conspiracy. You'll get a lot of Illuminati videos, which I don't, give a whole lot of credit to that personally, but whatever. Anyways, the limousine here, you can see the Secret Service agent jumps on the back and they kind of flee. This is a picture of Lee Harvey Oswald, the shooter. You might say, like, well, why didn't we hook him up to a lie detector test? Well, here's what happens to him if you don't know. Lee Harvey Oswald is held, I believe he is held for about 10 hours. They questioned him, and then they were going to transport him to, a more secure prison. When they take him outside, there's a man waiting outside for him by the name of Jack Ruby, and Jack Ruby, you can see there, pulls out a gun and shoots him. Jack Ruby had cancer. Jack Ruby is also dies before he can stand trial for the killing of Lee Harvey Oswald. So there's just a lot of kind of weird stuff around this event. All right, so let's talk about the impact of the assassination. So JFK becomes kind of this martyr for America, and he's the first in a number of assassinations. JFK is assassinated, Martin Luther King's assassinated, RFK we know is assassinated, and there's other people, other prominent people that are assassinated during this time, and it's just kind of interesting. It really shows how the country is coming unglued, I guess is the best way of putting it. I know my mom, was, let's see, how old was she? 60? She would have been in high school in the 60s and going into college. And I know she talks about, like, she just felt like the country was ripping apart and that we would never recover from this. In her history classes in college, she said they talked about, like, the 5 marks of, like, how a civilization fails. And she felt like we had all 5 marks and we were failing and that our country would not be, what it had been. And she was just nervous we would never recover. I thought that was just an interesting take kind of on what the chaos of the 60s. So Lyndon Johnson carries out JFK's war on poverty. He's going to create his own programs. We're going to talk about these Great Society programs here. This is a great visual for you. I encourage you to take a second and look at it. You've got culture, immigration, environment, civil rights, health, war on poverty, education. These are the areas that he's focusing on. He said the United States is behind. We need to catch up. We need to help different groups out and get them involved, and make sure that they have the funding that they need to be American citizens and be good citizens. Excuse me, in the United States. One of those areas is the Federal Food Assistance Program, food stamps, created under Lyndon Johnson. Job Corps. This is, I don't know how to explain this. I've had a couple students go into this. I've had students that, like, they want, it's not the same as a GED, but, like, basically you go to school, it's kind of a limited curriculum, but then you're learning, like, skills to actually do a job. You have to, have a certain income, like, below, your income has to be below a certain line, meaning that, the family usually is impoverished. It also is supposed to help train you to, get a job so that you can advance in society. Head Start, similar idea, just with young kids. It's the idea that families that can't afford preschool is not public. Preschools are private for the most part, unless you go to a Head Start program. So this was to try to help people. Originally it was 2 months, later on they expanded. But it's to help disadvantaged families get, a head start with their kids so that when their kids go into kindergarten, they're at the same level that other families that have put their kids in preschools are at. We've talked about the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act to help African Americans, his contributions to the civil rights movement. You also have HUD. I don't know if you've ever heard of HUD houses. Down here, you don't really see this as much. Up north, it's a big thing. Houses that are abandoned or condemned, they just kind of sit there empty. They can be, eventually, I hate to make, I don't want to make a joke, but it's true that a lot of those houses end up turning into, like, crack houses or stash houses. and the government wanted to make sure that they cleaned up the cities, and so they will offer HUD houses. They'll clean them up a little bit, but they will sell them to people for a really like cheap rate. In certain places, I know they offer teachers HUD houses so that they can get, one, they can get those houses filled with somebody, so it's not a place that breeds drugs or those kinds of things. There's also part of housing and urban development, or HUD. They also help with paying for mortgages for homes or rent for people, low-income families. They give loans to the elderly and disabled to help them out. Medicare and Medicaid, I would actually argue, as far as the Great Society goes, this is going to be Johnson's probably biggest contribution that you guys have heard of, and it still exists today. It's a big deal. Medicaid is given to poverty-stricken families. It's usually just provided for pregnant women and children, just depending on state and like regulations. I think that's how South Carolina works. Other places, like just the family, if they qualify at a certain income bracket, then you get Medicaid. Medicare, it's not really based on income, it's based on age. It used to be 65 and older, now it's 60, I think it's 68 and older. I gotta remember. I'm not sure if it's that or if that's Social Security only. But both my parents actually have Medicare. Even though they have insurance, Medicare is government assistance. A lot of medications for elderly people can be very expensive. When my grandma had a heart attack, her heart medication to keep her alive was $3,000 a month. She could not afford that, and so Medicare helped her pay that $3,000. The National Endowments for the Arts was created during this time period. That's where we get NPR from, which is National Public Radio. I do not like that personally. I know there's a lot of people that really like NPR. I'm not a huge fan. It puts me to sleep, I'll be honest. And PBS, which I know a lot of you guys have watched Sesame Street or some PBS programs. I'm a big fan of Downton Abbey, which was a PBS show. But these were funded by the government partially. They're also partially public funded as well. So the government helped create those. You've got also the Water Quality Act and the Air Quality Act, passed with the EPA idea. Clean water, clean air. Rachel Carson wrote a book called Silent Spring, which people were using DDT, which is a pesticide. And what was happening is the birds would eat these insects or, would eat, and these bugs had been infected with DDT. And it didn't cause the birds to die. It actually caused them to lay eggs with really thin shells. And so when they would sit on them, they would actually break the eggs. And so Rachel Carson advocated if we keep using DDT, then we'll have a silent spring. There won't be any birds left because there's no new birdies being created. So they included that later to expand for air pollution. A lot of similarities. FDR's New Deal, the Great Society have a lot of similarities between the two. Providing loans, providing jobs, providing aid to American citizens. It's not exactly the same, but it does have some similar qualities to that. The federal budget, it shows you, receipts and outlays, like what we're missing. And if you look, it significantly increases. Here's what our spending is on. Human resources increases in 68, as well as defense. Keep in mind the war, the Vietnam War is at its peak in 68, which is why you can see all that spending for national defense. Take a look here. You don't have to answer this question like on paper or anything, but if you look at the presidents, which one do you think is more successful between the two? It's kind of an interesting comparison since LBJ picks up after JFK. Kind of make that decision. Okay, guys, we are done with this section. Thanks for following along, and I will talk to you next time.